Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Eric Olson here, professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College as my book falls. uh, so I figured I'd make a little video talking about one of the topics in our textbook this week and maybe give a little bit more context that isn't really talked about. Now obviously this will date the video because I'm talking specifically about Ken Guest, Cultural Anthropology, the 3rd edition, but I think it's relevant to talk about gender creation and gender construction, which is something that's talked about in a lot of intro to anthropology and cultural anthropology textbooks. But I wanted to go through a few examples of how exactly gender can be created and constructed in a culture. And some of the 3 big examples I was going to use are gendered language, gender in sport, and gender in biological texts or biological studies. And how each of these can sort of create gender ideologies where it can be used as a means of enculturating gender norms and gender stereotypes. And so one of the first examples that I thought I would talk about is actually the Joe Rogan podcast. Now, I don't listen to the Joe Rogan podcast myself, so I can't really comment on the podcast. I just picked it because I knew Joe Rogan is this very machismo man, former mixed martial arts fighter, very muscular, easily a good example of someone who performs male gender and a very aggressive form of male gender, at least based on his background and whatnot. Leaving aside his political stance and how you feel about Joe Rogan, he's a good example of male gender performance. And what I found interesting when I started looking for examples of gendered language use and how we don't even consciously probably realize this when we're talking as either someone, cisgendered male, cisgendered female, is sometimes the turn order that we take when we interrupt people, the kinds of things we talk about is in a way reinforcing gender stereotypes, gender ideologies, and how they can be constructed. So something that stuck out to me right away when looking at the Joe Rogan podcast is his guests. So they're overwhelmingly males talking about male things. You've got Tristan Harris, Alex Jones, and Tim Dillon, Kanye West, Matthew McConaughey, Edward Snowden, Tim Kennedy, Ron White. And then we finally get to Miley Cyrus, and then males, male. And I believe I got to scroll to finally get to another female who was interviewed. And I believe it was maybe Tulsi Gabbard. But the point being that you may not even realize this in your life, but males communicating with other males is going to bring about a different gender dynamic to communication than males talking to females and females talking to males. And so to really illustrate that example, I pulled 2 clips. Now, this is not to say I've done an exhaustive systematic study of how Joe Rogan talks to his co-host. And to be clear, a podcast host is presumably going to have a slightly different cadence to their speech when they're doing a podcast than necessarily their common communication in everyday life when they might be having a conversation with someone off the cuff. Although arguably speaking, a podcast is closer to that typical speech pattern that you might encounter in everyday life, which might give us a little bit of a kernel into speech patterns of males versus females, at least in male gender dynamics. So take a look at this interview with Tony Hawk, where I know this is a great freeze frame of him, by the way, but this interview with Tony Hawk, and you could probably listen to the whole episode. I certainly did not. I was just looking for examples of this, just to illustrate a point here. I know bad journalism, bad research, but just to illustrate the point of turn order and the context of the things that they're talking about. So notice how Tony Hawk sort of offers up these opportunities in turn order where an interruption could happen, interjection, sort of allowing another speaker to possibly interrupt him, and how when it's 2 males talking to each other, Joe doesn't interrupt. And then we'll contrast that with a clip from Miley Cyrus, just to illustrate the idea that you might not consciously realize these have been enculturated in your gender performance, whether you're raised to perform the gender of male or female or some other gender category. The way we speak is also encoded with gender as a construct. So we'll just listen to a little bit of this.
The barrel, and it was the most frightening thing I've ever seen in my life, because it was like a massive hollow wave that you see in movies, that you see Laird just dancing around in, and I'm like, I'm not getting near that thing. And I immediately just,
So you might notice he has these pauses in his speech pattern, and in many forms of communication, those pauses in the speech pattern might be an opportunity for some other speaker to interject, to interrupt, to offer up. In the case of Joe Rogan, he might offer up affirmations or words of affirmation like, wow, yes, mm-hmm. Not really things that are meant to interrupt the speaker, but to confirm that you're listening and you're actively listening, which you'll find in pretty much any case, whether you're male or female in a gender performance, but or in either gendered language. But notice that and how he doesn't really say anything, and compare that to Miley Cyrus here talking about RuPaul and being on RuPaul.
The time that I'm cooking for you to be using that time for my meditation, and I become that person. Like, I just give so much.
Right.
And I just love that she says, if you can't love yourself, how in the hell are you going to love anybody else? I really love that.
Good point.
It's a really good point. I'm trying to just, like, that needs to be tattooed on my brain. So.
Well, RuPaul's also been around a long.
So just note, in roughly the same time span of a typical conversation, note how those same pauses that Tony Hawk is making, and you could probably find other examples of this throughout not just the Joe Rogan podcast, but how males and females tend to speak in American culture. You find instantaneously that male speech patterns tend to interrupt, especially when talking to females. And you see that with Joe Rogan here in this example too. He interrupts her. It's a good point. He doesn't necessarily have to say that. He could use a different form of affirmation of, yep. And then he interrupts her before she's finished saying the sentence. So interruption being a common speech pattern of male gender performance as well. So speech patterns, these things that we learn growing up as we develop, how males talk to other males, how males talk to females, how females talk to other females, how females talk to other males, so on and so forth, is a form of gender enculturation, and something that you probably don't consciously think about, but is very much there when you're looking for it. And that's what we as anthropologists are trying to look for. So another example of sort of how is gender constructed, and how can we start to unpack what genders look like and how they sort of come into being. This idea of male machismo, where does it come from? Another example of that would be also from our textbook, talking about the Landers and Fine studies from the 1990s about Little League and T-ball. So what I ended up doing is I pulled some videos on baseball coaches, and specifically Little League baseball coaches. And pay attention here. We're looking specifically at sort of how male gender is constructed. We could look at female gender and how it's constructed as well, but I just figured I'd use male gender construction as an example here. You could do the same with female, non-binary, etc. Pay attention to the sorts of words that are used in these baseball coaches. Note the negativity, the negative reinforcement, using sort of mockery as a form of reinforcement, aggression, domination, these sort of assertive languages. So you can sort of see that how that sort of coaching can reinforce this in our speech patterns as well. Well, I was raised in an environment that coaches say dominate, be aggressive, get the ball, hit dingers, all these sorts of speech that reinforce this aggressive machismo behavior that spills over into other aspects of gender performance, such as interrupting other females when they're talking, like in the case of Miley Cyrus, or in the way we perceive reproduction, which we'll get to in our last example. So let's look at a few examples here of some Little League coaches. And I made sure that I opened up, I didn't log into YouTube just in case the algorithm. So in all of these cases, I tried to log out of my account so the algorithm didn't give me biased sort of examples, like I'm looking for data. So I tried to just pull up some examples. Didn't do any sort of filtering. Otherwise, I just watched a few of them. And I think they illustrate a good point of how sport and coaching can really enculture gender performance. So let's take a look at this baseball coach saying the number one most important thing for baseball coaches, the first team meeting. So listen and pay attention to the language he uses just in the first few sentences.
The number one most important thing for baseball coaches is to dominate the first team and parent meeting. And
I mean, we could go on from there, but I think that sort of sums what I'm getting at here with gender construction. Immediately saying dominate the first meeting.
This is so important because it sets the precedent for the rest of the year. And if you are able as a coach to communicate exactly what you want to happen along the year and set out rules and guidelines.
So also note things like setting out rules, guidelines, what you want to have happen as a coach. The Flinders and Fine, or the Landers and Fine study, not Flinders, Landers and Fine study from 1996 talks about how coaches were very aggressive and concerned about success amongst their male athletes, in t-ball, mind you, this is like 4 or 5-year-olds, versus their female counterparts who didn't receive feedback, didn't receive rules or guidance. They were just there and didn't really get a whole lot of feedback. So let's look at a couple other examples. I pulled up this Little League coach. Just pay attention to the language he uses and think about how this is enculturating gender performance of male aggression, male domination. And so when we wonder how toxic masculinity is formed, it's in these sorts of examples of, Little League coaching and gendered language performance. So it's not necessarily this one pinpoint thing that we can turn to. It's sort of this gender ideology that's pretty pervasive and easily reproduced because we view it as pervasive. And we'll get into the last example in a moment, how we even use biology and what we think of as natural to reinforce those gender ideologies. But let's take a listen to this coach and the next coach real quick and get some more examples of that sort of gender construction.
Try to win. I like the second half.
Try to win is what he says.
Nate, you got another one? Rylan, you don't have any other goals. Aiden?
Get out.
Okay, negative Ghost Rider. All right. Did we learn anything this season?
Yes.
Our goals, no, not even close. Our goals are, listen, our goals are to hit dingers. Everybody better have their eyes on me. Eyes on me, Rylan. Hit dingers. Disgrace the pitcher's family. Make the other players cry and stomp their butts into the ground. Does that?
Yeah, so not great. This is the kind of things that reinforce gender ideologies, cultural constructions of gender. If you wonder how toxic masculinity is formed, it's in speeches like this that encourage male aggression. Boys will be boys. This idea that it's natural for males to be aggressive. The perception that males just need to be dominating, aggressive, assertive, violent, stomping out the competition, kick their butts, make them cry. That kind of language is reinforcing a gender ideology about violent and aggressive masculinity. So being male and performing your male gender must coincide with being violent, aggressive, angry, and dominant. So that's just another example of how gender can be constructed in sport and through language. We'll look at one more example here with coaches.
Did I seem wasted during tryouts? Because I can't figure out how you made it on this team. Clearly, practice does not appear to be working. This is why everyone talks about you as soon as you leave the dugout. I knew you couldn't do it. Did you take your Adderall this morning? Because you're acting kind of freaky out here.
Yeah, so these examples, and I'm happy to put this guy on blast. I think, I think myself as an educator, I had a very different upbringing than this. Than having to deal with the coaches like this. I was in sports up until 9th grade, but I was in multiple different sports. And I just realized it wasn't for me because of the toxic masculinity and the reinforcement of this male aggressive behavior. And it just wasn't for me. I didn't want to be in an environment that reinforced this. I mean, not to say the little me was an anthropologist growing, but the point being, this kind of gender enculturation is not good. This reinforces the idea of toxic masculinity, and this is why we see time and again in sports in particular that time and again we see domestic violence, physical abuse towards spouses and partners in professional sports, because when you have coaches that use this kind of gendered language to reinforce toxic masculinity, male aggression. The idea that to be male is to be violent, to be angry, to dominate, to assert yourself, to stomp the enemy, to make them cry. When that's what you hear on a regular basis in, primary education, K through 12, and being coached, just imagine if your entire career is being surrounded with that kind of male performance. And so it can lead to just a natural progression of aggression. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is with gender enculturation and using nature as sort of a crutch to reinforce these gender ideologies. So oddly enough, someone who I think does a great job with educational content, Hank Green here, talking about reproduction and treating it basically as males are doing all the action. All of the male biological aspects of fertilization are active, aggressive movement. So thinking things like swimming. So actually, before I do this video, let's take a moment to look at WebMD's description here. So a man may ejaculate 40 million to 150 million sperm, which start swimming upstream towards the fallopian tubes on their mission to fertilize an egg. Fast swimming sperm can reach the egg in half an hour, while others may take days. So essentially, and then the last sentence here, only a few hundred will even come close to the egg because of the many natural barriers that exist in a woman's body. So note how the primacy is given to the sperm. The sperm are swimmers. So there's very much a passive role being given to the female reproductive system. And the language that we use is just reinforcing these gender ideologies. And what we find biologically, and I'll put this link in the description, this sort of synthesis of some recent Vice article, or this Vice article, which is a synthesis of recent studies in female genitalia biologically, female reproduction is not as passive as we thought it was. The egg actually moves. It has chemical responses that need to happen in order for the sperm to actually come in. So it's not just receiving things and not doing anything. We also need to acknowledge, why is the vagina so anti-sperm? Why is it acidic that kills off a lot of sperm? Why is it really difficult for the sperm to get into the fallopian tubes? And that partially is the result of a dominance in male gender performance, assuming that, well, nature is male dominance, female passivity. Therefore, why should we even bother studying female genitalia and female gonads when we know that it's all about the male dominance? And so that Vice article does a really interesting job of talking about the complexities of female genitalia to resist male genitalia, because males force themselves on females in a lot of biological cases. And so the female actually has a choice in receiving a partner. So choosing to actually want to have a kid with someone is not exactly something that just happens. You can't just have sex and assume pregnancy. So relaxing the muscles around the vagina, being willing to have sex, and the mucus secretions meant to limit the actual success of sperm, because females want to have control over their actual bodies and pregnancies, having some say in reproductive access. And so it's interesting. Let's contrast that sort of recent biological research with how Hank Green presents fertilization.
Penetrate an oocyte. Not yet. They could literally hang out right next to one for hours and be unable to make a move until they are what's known as capacitated and go through one last set of changes. As they swim through the cervix, uterus, and fallopian tube, female secretions start to degrade some of the sperm's protective proteins until the cap on the tip of its little head, called the acrosome, is...
So notice this is pretty much, at least in this video, I watched the whole thing, and this is pretty much the only time I notice Hank Green talks about what the female reproductive system is doing to fertilize the egg. So, activating those chemicals that start to dissolve the acrosome on the top of the sperm. Beyond that, it's very much this passive aggressive sort of framing of reproduction where males are aggressive, females are passive and receptive. What we're really seeing when we start to do biological research is that it's not that simple and it's not that binary. They work in tandem. They work together, the egg and the sperm, to bond together so that the sperm doesn't just float away and actually bonds to the egg and more likely is going to have success in fertilization. So this idea that somehow, males are active is really a reflection of our own gender ideologies being grafted onto the actual observations of sexual reproduction and fertilization. And so we have to be careful of how nature, at least in this case, and granted, I only gave you like 30 seconds of this video, but you're welcome to go watch this crash course video in its entirety to get that sort of receptor, aggressor, swimming, so forth. We have to be careful when we try to use biology and nature to reinforce these ideologies, because just as with gender ideologies, you can try and use fertilization as a justification for, well, even if we start out, at the beginning of life and conception, the males are the aggressors, and thus they must be the aggressors naturally. That same kind of reasoning has been used to justify a lot of other unsavory things that, we today in 2021 know just aren't good. Things like, I don't know, race and racism. Those used to have biological bases, which are based on bad science and inaccurate science, trying to use nature as a justification for racial classifications, mental intelligence, and thus justifying discrimination. So we have to be careful and cognizant as anthropologists to look at why are these sort of ideologies reproduced, what's their function, and how are they constructed. So it's not to say that we have to inherently view gender ideologies as bad, but we have to acknowledge how they're created and start to understand them in order to start to unpack them further. So hopefully you got something out of this video. Hopefully it provides a little more context on how gender is constructed and gives you some examples that you can find in your own life and see how gender is reinforced and enculturated in your own life in ways that you might not have thought about before. So I'll see you in the next video, and until then, never stop learning.